No one wanted to mate with a disabled Apache girl until the quiet sheriff rode into town and before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The Arizona sun was still hanging high when the street turned quiet enough for everyone to hear the shuffling limp of the girl by the water trough. The heat pressed down hard, pulling sweat out of every man and beast in the town, but she stood in it anyway because there was nowhere else to stand. Naya kept her weight on the good leg, careful not to tip too far. If she put too much strain on the bad one, her knee would buckle and she would fall, and she couldn't bear the sound of them laughing again. Her dress was buckskin, the kind women of her people wore, but worn thin and patched with clumsy stitches from her own hands. One strap had been tied back together after it had snapped weeks ago, and the knot kept slipping, showing the smooth line of her collarbone before she tugged it back in place. Her braid was neat, long and heavy, but dust clung to it and made it look dull. She kept her head down, not because she was ashamed, but because looking back at them would only make it worse. She had been here since morning, waiting, hoping that someone might offer her food or a place to sleep. So far, all she had gotten were looks that told her she didn't belong. A pair of boys sat on the edge of the boardwalk, whispering, snickering when she stumbled once. A woman coming out of the store muttered under her breath, "Ought to keep moving." The words landed hard. Naya had nowhere to move to. Sheriff Nathan Cole heard it all from across the street. He had been leaning in the doorway of his office, watching the town bake under the heat. Nathan was 33, tall, and built broad across the shoulders. His shirt sleeves were rolled, showing forearms browned by the sun. A week's worth of stubble darkened his jaw, but his gray-green eyes were sharp, steady. He had been a cavalry scout once, a job that taught him to look at a man, or a situation, long enough to know which way it would go before it did. He had seen Naya before, passing on the edge of town 2 days back, moving like someone running from something that would not stop following her. Now she was here, alone, and the town was circling her like dogs. Nathan hated that look, the one men get when they think someone is too small to fight back. He stepped off the boardwalk and crossed the street. His boots hit the hard dirt slow and even. He didn't rush. Men who rush look nervous, and Nathan Cole had made a life out of never letting anyone see him nervous. The boys saw him coming first, went quiet fast, then got up and moved down the street. He stopped a step away from Naya. Up close, he could see how thin she was. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes ringed dark from hunger and no sleep. Her leg had been broken at some point, badly set and never fixed right, and every time she shifted, pain flashed across her face before she pushed it down. "Can you walk?" Nathan asked. His voice was quiet, even the way it always was when he needed to give someone a choice. Naya looked up at him, searching his face. Men who offered help usually wanted something after. She had learned that the hard way on the trail. But this man's eyes stayed steady on hers, not drifting, not demanding. She nodded once. "Come on then," Nathan said. He turned and started walking toward the edge of town. Naya hesitated for half a breath, long enough to feel every eye still on her, then followed, limping through the dust. No one called after them, but she could feel their stares all the way down the road. Nathan's cabin sat beyond the last fence, past the cottonwoods that lined the shallow wash. It was a plain place, a single room with a stove, a table, a narrow bed, and a few pegs on the wall for his hat and coat. The corral leaned in on one side, needing repair, and the porch steps sagged enough to make it tricky for her to climb with her bad leg. "Inside," Nathan said, holding the door for her. She stepped into the shade. The air smelled of coffee grounds and wood smoke. Her heart thudded hard in her chest, bracing for what would come next, but Nathan didn't touch her. He poured water from a bucket into the pot on the stove and set beans to boil. When they were done, he cut a heel of bread and put on the table. "Sit," he said simply. She lowered herself onto the chair, careful with her leg. The smell of beans nearly undid her. She hadn't eaten since yesterday, and her stomach twisted so hard it hurt. He set the tin plate in front of her, sat across from her, and ate without speaking. She followed his lead, eating slow, not because she wanted to, but because she didn't know if more food would come later. When the plates were clean, Nathan leaned back in his chair. "What's your name?" he asked. "Naya," she said. He nodded. "Nathan." That was all. He didn't ask where she had come from or who she had lost. He didn't offer promises. When night came, he put a blanket near the stove. "Sleep there," he said. She obeyed, laying down slow, keeping her bad leg straight so it wouldn't throb too much. For a long time, she kept her eyes open, listening to him move around the cabin. But when the chair creaked and stayed still, when she heard only the wind through the cottonwoods outside and the low crackle of the fire, her body finally let go. Nathan sat with his boots still on, watching the flames die down. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The town would have plenty to say about the sheriff taking in a girl no one wanted, but he had made his choice. For the first time in months, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. Morning came early, the pale light creeping across the cabin floor until it reached the blanket near the stove. Naya's eyes opened fast, as if waking anywhere, but the open ground still startled her. For a moment she didn't move, unsure if she was still allowed to be here. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke and beans from the night before. Nathan was already awake, pulling on his boots near the door. He noticed her watching and gave a small nod. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. She pushed herself up, slow, so her bad leg wouldn't catch. The first step made her bite the inside of her cheek. Pain was sharp in the mornings, before the joint warmed. She limped to the stove and poured coffee into a tin cup with both hands so it wouldn't spill. It was bitter and hot, but it steadied her. Nathan stepped outside, and she heard the barn door creak open, the mule shifting inside. She hesitated, cup in hand, then followed to the porch. The air was cold enough to sting her nose, the ground wet with dew. He looked back over his shoulder. "You can stay inside if you want." "I help?" she said, the words short but certain. He studied her for a second, then nodded once and went back to work. She stood near the fence post, leaning on it, watching how he forked hay into the trough. When he turned to carry water, she took the empty bucket without asking. She walked slow but steady to the pump, worked the handle until the water splashed over her fingers, then carried it back. Her arms shook from the weight, but she didn't let spill. By the time the stock were fed, the sun was high enough to warm the porch. Nathan went to mend a broken rail on the corral. Naya followed and crouched near him, holding the new plank while he hammered. The first strike made her flinch, a sharp memory from when noise meant danger. But she kept her grip until the board was set. When the work was done, he stood and looked at her for a long moment. "You know how to sweep?" She nodded. He brought out an old broom with half its bristles gone and handed it to her. She started on the porch, working slow at first, then faster when she realized she could do it without tripping. Each stroke pushed more dust into the yard, clearing the boards until they looked almost new. When she was finished, she stood straighter, chest rising with something close to pride. Inside, Nathan had set beans to soak for later. He showed her how to stir the fire down so it wouldn't burn through the wood too fast, and how to open the flue to draw the smoke. She repeated the words in English, careful, and he nodded, approving. Around noon, a rider came up the road. Naya's shoulders tensed until she saw it was just a deputy. Hale slowed near the porch, gave her a long look, then said to Nathan, "Town's already talking." "They'll get tired of it," Nathan said flat. Hale shifted in the saddle. "They think she's trouble. Then they can think it quiet," Nathan answered, voice calm but firm. Hale stared another second, then touched his brim and rode on. Naya had been standing still, gripping the porch rail. She glanced at Nathan, as if trying to see if he was angry. "You're safe here," he said simply. It was the first time anyone had told her that since she ran from the men who raided her village. She looked away quick so he wouldn't see her eyes burn. That evening she mended the loose strap of her dress with a bit of thread she found in his box. Nathan sat sharpening a knife, watching her work by the glow of the lamp. When she finished, the dress fit better across her shoulder. She caught him looking, and for the first time, she didn't feel like hiding. When night came, she took the same place near the stove. The cabin felt less strange now. Nathan banked the fire, hung his hat on the peg, and sat in the chair by the door. Naya closed her eyes, still listening for danger out of habit. But the only sound was the soft tick of the stove as it cooled in Nathan's steady breathing across the room. Her body loosened, sleep taking her before she realized she had stopped being afraid. The next morning started clear and cool, the kind of morning that smelled of wet dirt and cottonwood leaves. Nathan was already outside setting posts when Naya came to the door, braid tight, dress freshly tied. She stood watching for a moment, then limped out to join him. He handed her a rail without speaking, showing her where to hold it steady while he drove the nails. The hammer strikes echoed sharp in the still air. At first, she jumped every time the head hit metal, the sound too much like the strike of iron she remembered from the raid. Nathan noticed and slowed his rhythm, letting her watch each swing before the next one landed. By the third rail, she was bracing it without flinching, the set of her shoulders firm. They worked until the sun climbed high, sweat running down Nathan's jaw, dust streaking Naya's arms. When he saw her leg trembling from standing too long, he told her to sit on the rail while he finished the last nails. She obeyed but kept her eyes on him, memorizing how he set each board so she could do it herself one day. By noon, the pen stood straighter than it had in years. Nathan leaned on the post and looked toward the cabin. "Steps too high for you," he said at last, more to himself than to her. He went to the shed and came back with a saw and 2 cedar boards. Naya sat on the porch watching as he measured, cut, and planed until the boards fit square. When he was done, he set the new step in place, wide enough for her to put both feet on it at once without catching the bad leg. She tested it carefully, first the good leg, then the bad. The wood was smooth, the rise just low enough that she could climb without dragging her foot. She looked up at him and nodded once. No words, but her face softened in a way that told him what it meant to her. Inside, Nathan took out a small box from the shelf and set it on the table. Inside were a few needles and spools of thread. He showed her how to wax the thread and push the needle through leather, slow and careful, so she wouldn't prick her fingers. She repaired the strap of her dress properly this time, stitching it tight so it would not slip. The neckline now stayed where it should, though it still framed her throat and the soft line of her chest when she bent forward. When she held the dress up for his approval, Nathan only gave a short nod. "Better," he said. That evening they ate beans and cornbread. The salt was heavy, but it made her smile for the first time, a quick one that caught him off guard. After supper, she cleaned the dishes and then limped to the porch without being told. Nathan followed and sat on the top step, arms resting on his knees. The night was quiet, the sky wide and full of stars. She stayed beside him, sweeping dust with the edge of her boot. After a long while, she asked softly, "Why you help me?" He didn't answer right away, just watched the horizon where the last light faded. "Because it was wrong, what they did," he said finally. "And because no one else would." She nodded slowly, thinking on that. No one else had offered her a place. No one else had given her a reason to stay. When she stood to go inside, her leg buckled suddenly. Before she could fall, Nathan caught her arm, steady and quick. For a second she froze, his hand warm against her sleeve, his grip firm but not hurting. Her eyes searched his face for the thing she had learned to fear in men, but there was nothing there except calm. "Easy," he said. She found her balance and stepped back, her pulse still high, but this time she did not retreat to the far side of the cabin. She stayed near the stove while he banked the fire, and when she lay down, her hand rested open on the blanket, not clenched tight like before. Nathan sat in his chair, hat tipped forward, and for the first time in years the cabin felt like it might be more than just a place to sleep. 2 weeks passed before Nathan decided they couldn't put off town any longer. Flour was nearly gone, coffee low, and the fence repairs had used up the last of his nails. He told Naya the night before. "We go at first light," he said. She didn't argue or look afraid, only nodded once, as if she had known this day was coming and had already made her choice to face it. Morning came with a thin frost on the grass. Nathan hitched the mule to the wagon while Naya stood by the porch, adjusting the strap of her dress. Her braid was tied tight, and she had taken the time to smooth her hair so it shone in the early light. The boots she wore were still too big, but she had learned to keep them cinched with scraps of leather, so they stayed on her feet. She climbed onto the bench on her own, steady despite the limp. Nathan glanced at her, then gave a short nod and flicked the reins. The wagon rolled toward the main road. The ride was quiet, the sound of iron wheels over ruts filling the space between them. Nathan noticed the way Naya's eyes never stopped moving, scanning the horizon as if trouble might ride out of it at any moment. He understood. He had done the same for months after the war. By the time they reached town, the sun was warming the roofs and men were already on the boardwalk. The same boys who had laughed at her weeks before were there, leaning against a post, and their grins faded when they saw Nathan step down from the wagon. He tied off the mule, then held out a hand.
Naya hesitated for just a second, then took it and climbed down. They crossed the street together, his long stride slow enough for her to keep up without stumbling. The general store was cool inside, smelling of coffee and grain. Nathan gathered what they needed: flour, nails, rope, while Naya stood near the door, hands clasped in front of her. When they passed the bolts of cloth, Nathan stopped, thumbed through until he found a length of soft calico, and held it up. "For a new dress," he said simply. She touched the fabric carefully, as though it might vanish if she wasn't gentle. There was a flicker in her eyes, surprise first, then something softer. She tucked the fabric to her chest and followed him to the counter.
When they stepped outside, Deputy Hale was waiting on the boardwalk. He had the look of a man who'd been asked questions all week and didn't like answering them. "Sheriff," he said with a tight nod. Then his eyes cut to Naya. "Town's been asking why she's here." Nathan's jaw set. "She's under my roof," he said, calm but final. "That's all they need to know." Hale shifted his weight, glancing toward the group of men by the saloon who were watching too closely. "They think she's trouble." "Then let them think it," Nathan said. His voice didn't rise, but it had the kind of weight that ended conversations. Hale gave a slow nod, like a man deciding he didn't want to test him further, and stepped aside. Naya had stood still the whole time, her chin lifted though her hands gripped the fabric tight. When they reached the wagon, Nathan saw the way her shoulders dropped once they were out of sight. "They talk because they've got nothing better to do," he said as he loaded the flour. "Let them." Her lips pressed together. Then she nodded and climbed onto the bench. The road home was quieter than the one there. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain. Naya kept one hand on the folded calico, not letting go until they reached the cabin. When she stepped down, she didn't hurry inside. She stood for a moment on the porch, looking around the yard as if seeing it differently now. Not just a place where she had been left, but a place she might stay. That evening, she cut the cloth into careful pieces of the table, Nathan watching from the chair by the stove as he mended a broken bridle strap. Her movements were slow but sure, her face focused. When she looked up and caught him watching, she didn't look away this time. Later, when the stew was cooking, she stepped outside. The air was cool and smelled of wet dirt, the clouds low over the cottonwoods. Nathan joined her on the porch. They didn't speak, just stood side by side while the light faded. The town's stares and whispers had followed them home. But out here there was only the wind in the trees and the steady sound of the mule in the pen. Naya breathed deep, her shoulders loosening. And for the first time since she had arrived, she looked less like someone waiting to run and more like someone who was deciding to stay. The rain came during the night, soft at first, and then steady enough to drum on the roof and turn the yard to mud. By morning, the air smelled clean and sharp. Nathan stepped outside to check the corral while Naya stayed at the table, sewing by lamplight. The calico was nearly all pieced together now, her stitches straight despite the roughness of the thread. She kept the neckline high enough to sit proper, but shaped it to fit close across her shoulders so it would not slip again. When Nathan came back in, boots wet and his shirt damp, he saw the almost finished dress laid out across the table. He stopped, looked at the careful seams, then at her. "You finish it today?" "Yes," she said, lifting her chin. There was pride there, quiet but steady. He gave a short nod and went to hang his coat. By midday, the rain eased. Naya disappeared behind the hanging blanket that served as a screen and came out a few minutes later wearing the new dress. It fit her close at the waist, the skirt falling neat over her boots. The sleeves framed her arms instead of hanging loose, and the neckline sat right above the soft rise of her chest, modest but no longer slipping. She stood still, hands fisted in the fabric, waiting for his judgment. Nathan set down the bridle he had been mending and looked at her fully. "Looks right," he said, simple but sincere. She gave the smallest of smiles, then turned and went to sweep the porch, moving easier now that the dress didn't fight her every step. Later, she carried a full bucket from the well, careful with each step across the damp yard. Halfway back, her bad leg slid in the mud. The bucket tilted and water sloshed over the side. She braced for the fall that had become too familiar in her life. But Nathan was already there, crossing the yard in 3 strides. His arm came around her ribs and held her upright. For a moment, neither of them moved. She felt his breath near her temple, the solid grip of his hand keeping her steady. When he was sure she had her balance, he eased his arm away. She didn't step back right away. She stood looking up at him, heart beating too hard in her chest. "Thank you," she said softly, first in her own language, then in English. He only nodded and took the bucket from her, carrying it the rest of the way. That evening the sky cleared, the sunset washing the cottonwoods gold. They sat on the porch steps, the air damp and cool. Nathan shelled beans into a tin bowl, and Naya worked beside him, her skirt brushing his knee when she shifted. The silence between them had changed. It no longer felt like the silence of strangers, but of people who had started to learn each other's ways. When the last of the beans were done, she stayed sitting beside him instead of going inside. "You think town talk stopped?" she asked finally. "They'll find someone else to talk about," Nathan said, calm as ever. She nodded slowly, satisfied with that answer. Then she surprised him by adding, "I stay here. I work. I help." He turned to look at her fully, saw that she meant it, then gave a short nod. "Then we'll make it work." The words settled something in her chest she hadn't even known was loose. For the first time since she had fled her village, she felt a little less like she was living one day at a time. Inside, the stew bubbled on the stove. When they finally went in, the cabin felt warmer, the air carrying the smell of beans and wood smoke. Nathan set his hat on the peg and glanced at her standing by the table with her hands on the back of the chair, dress fitting her like it had been made for her life here. He said nothing, but a faint line eased at the corner of his mouth as he sat down. That night, when she lay near the stove, she didn't face the door like before. She turned toward the fire instead, her breathing slow, her hand resting open on the blanket as though she had decided she no longer needed to run. The air turned strange 3 days later, dry, tense, the kind of air that made Nathan glance at the sky before the sun was even high. The wind came first, tugging at the edges of the wash and rattling the corral rails until they groaned. Nathan came in from the barn with his hat pulled low and his shirt streaked with grit. "Storm's coming," he said simply. Naya was at the table, rolling the last of the flour into rough dough. She didn't ask questions. She wiped her hands, tied her braid tighter, and followed him outside. Together they worked quick, latching the barn doors, pulling tools inside, bracing the chicken coop so nothing would break loose when the wind came hard. Nathan saw the way she moved now, faster, sure-footed despite the limp. She didn't wait for him to tell her what needed doing. She seemed to know. By the time they made it back to the cabin, the wind had started to sting with bits of sand. Nathan barred the door and dropped extra wood by the stove. Naya soaked rags and pressed them into the window cracks to keep the dust out. When the first gust hit hard enough to shake the walls, they both stood still for a moment, listening, then went back to work without saying much. When the worst of the wind hit, they sat near the stove, shoulders almost touching. The storm roared outside, but inside stayed steady. Nathan poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. She wrapped her hand around it, her face half lit by the fire. She looked at him after a long silence. "Why you help me?" she asked softly. He stared into the fire a moment before answering. "Because it was wrong, leaving you there, and because I want you safe here." The words seemed to settle her. She nodded, almost to herself, and drank the last of the coffee. A hard knock came at the door then, cutting through the wind. Nathan stood, hand near his belt out of old habit, and unbarred the door. Deputy Hale stood there with 2 other men from town, their coats flapping in the wind. "Sheriff," Hale said, raising his voice over the gusts. "Town's riled up. They say keeping her here is asking for trouble. She's under my roof, Nathan said, calm but hard. That's the end of it. One of the men stepped forward. She don't belong here. She's one of them. You know what that means. Nathan's jaw tightened. What it means is she's under my protection. If harm comes to her, it comes through me first. The men stared at him for a long moment, reading the truth in his face. Hale spat into the mud and nodded to the others. Let's go, he said. Ain't worth it. When the door shut again, Naya was still standing by the table, her hand gripping the back of the chair. Nathan set the bar back in place and looked at her. They won't bother you tonight, he said. She nodded, though her breath still came fast. After a moment, she went to the stove and stirred the beans. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. I can fight if they come. Nathan studied her a moment, then shook his head. You won't have to. That's my job. The storm eased toward midnight, leaving the cabin still and quiet. Nathan banked the fire, set his hat on the peg, and sat down heavily in the chair by the door. Naya lay near the stove, her hand open on the blanket, and for the first time since she had come, she didn't flinch when the wind rattled the shutters, because now she knew someone would stand between her and whatever came next. When Nathan closed his eyes, he realized he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not just duty, but the sharp certainty that bringing her here had been the right choice. The morning after the storm broke clear and sharp, the sky washed clean, the ground soft under their boots. Nathan stepped outside early to check the corral. Every rail still stood where they had braced them, every door still latched. The mule snorted and shook its head, impatient for feed, but nothing had been lost in the night. When he came back inside, Naya was already awake, sweeping grit out from the corners where the wind had forced it through. She moved with a calm purpose that hadn't been there when she first arrived. They worked most of the day, setting things right after the storm. Nathan showed her how to check the pen hinges and oil them so they wouldn't stick, and she held the rails while he drove new nails into the places the wind had loosened. Her limp was still there, but now she moved with more balance, using the strength in her arms to steady herself. Nathan noticed the way she didn't wait to be told. She handed him tools before he asked, carried feed buckets when she could, and even climbed halfway up the fence to fix a loose wire. In the afternoon, they dragged the bedding out of the cabin and laid it across the porch rail to air out. Naya tied her hair up off her neck and scrubbed the floorboards on her hands and knees until the wood looked lighter. Sweat ran down her temple and into the hollow of her collarbone, catching the dust on her skin. Nathan kept his eyes on the work, but more than once he caught himself watching her shoulders move as she worked the rag in long, steady strokes. When the chores were done, the yard looked neat again, the porch swept clean, the cabin smelling of soap and fresh air. Nathan leaned against the porch post, taking it all in, while Naya sat on the top step, rubbing the ache from her bad leg. You did good work today, he said after a long silence. Her head came up quick at that. No one had ever told her that before. I try, she said. You don't just try, Nathan answered, his voice low but certain. You do. Something in her face shifted at those words. She looked out across the yard for a long moment, as though deciding something. I'm not trouble, she said quietly. Nathan turned to face her fully. I know. Evening came soft, with the cottonwoods whispering overhead and the smell of wet earth still hanging in the air. After supper, Nathan sat on the porch rail, arms folded across his knees. Naya came out and sat on the step below him, the hem of her new dress brushing her boots. They stayed like that for a long time, watching the light fade. When the first stars came out, Nathan reached for the rail with one hand. Naya's hand rested close to it, and after a pause, she moved it just enough so her fingers brushed against his. He didn't pull away. The quiet stretched between them until it felt like something had finally clicked into place. Naya turned her face up toward him, dark eyes steady. Nathan leaned down, slow enough to give her time to move if she wanted. She didn't. Their lips met, soft at first, then firmer as the tension that had hung between them for weeks finally eased. When they broke apart, she stayed close, her hand still on his. No words came. None were needed. The air was warm, the night calm, and for the first time Nathan let himself breathe easy. When they finally went inside, The cabin no longer felt like it held two strangers. It felt like a place with two lives in it, lives that had started to turn toward each other, steady as the rails they had built that morning. The next morning, Nathan was up before first light, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee, thinking. The decision had been turning in his head since the night before, since the moment her hand stayed on his and her lips met his. The town could talk all it wanted, but he was done letting them wonder where he stood. When Naya came out from behind the blanket, still braiding her hair, he looked at her and said simply, "We're going to town today." She paused, fingers still in her braid. "Why?" "To write it proper," he said. Her eyes widened, a flicker of surprise, then something like relief. She finished the braid without another word and went to wash her face. When she came back, she wore the calico dress she had made. It seemed clean and neat, the neckline straight. Nathan noticed how she had tied the belt so it fit snug at her waist. And for a moment, he let himself take in how right she looked standing in the cabin like she belonged there. They rode into town just as the sun was clearing the ridge, the mule's hooves knocking steady on the hard-packed road. The same men who had stared before were on the porch again, but Nathan didn't look away this time. He tied off the mule and held out his hand. Naya took it, stepping down sure-footed, her chin lifted. They walked side by side to the clerk's office, the bell over the door ringing sharp when they stepped inside. The clerk, a man who had known Nathan since he was a boy, looked up from his ledger. His brows rose at the sight of Naya, standing there beside him, calm and straight-backed, her braid over one shoulder. "Morning, Cole," the clerk said carefully. "Morning," Nathan replied. "Need it written down, my name and hers." The clerk reached for the ledger, turning it to a fresh page. "Her name." Naya's voice was steady. "Naya," she said clearly, pronouncing each syllable so there was no mistake. The clerk nodded and wrote it down, then looked back to Nathan. "Last name?" "Cole," Nathan said. The clerk wrote it with slow, deliberate strokes, the scratch of the pen loud in the quiet room. When he was done, he turned the book so Nathan could see. Nathan read the line once, then nodded. It was official now, there for anyone to read. On the way out, they passed Deputy Hale. He looked from Nathan to Naya, then back again. For a long second, he said nothing, then gave the smallest of nods and stepped aside. It was the first time he hadn't looked at her like she was trouble. Before leaving town, Nathan stopped at the peddler's cart and bought a plain brass ring and a bolt of stronger thread. Naya held the ring in her palm as they rode home, turning it slowly as though she couldn't quite believe it was hers. Back at the cabin, Nathan nailed a second peg by the door so her shawl could hang next to his hat. He set the ledger slip from the clerk on the table until he could put it somewhere safe. When Naya hung her shawl on the new peg, she glanced at him over her shoulder, and he saw the smallest smile at the corner of her mouth. That evening they ate stew thickened with cornmeal. The day's dust still clung to their boots, but neither of them cared. When Nathan reached across the table to take her bowl, his fingers brushed hers, and this time she didn't pull away. Later, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, they sat on the porch. The air was cool, the yard quiet except for the soft sounds of the mule in the pen. Nathan reached into his pocket, pulled out the brass ring, and held it out to her. "It's not much," he said, voice low. Naya slid it onto her finger, looked at it a long moment, then looked back at him. "Is enough," she said simply. When the stars came out, Nathan leaned over and kissed her again, slower this time, no rush, no fear. She stayed close after, leaning her head against his shoulder while the night settled around them. Inside, the cabin glowed with the lamplight, and for the first time it looked not just lived in but claimed. Not by one person, but by two. By the time summer settled in, the town had stopped staring every time Nathan and Naya came down the main road together. Folks still talked, but the words no longer carried the sharp edge they once did. Nathan's quiet certainty had a way of wearing people down. The clerk greeted Naya by name the next time they stepped into the office, and even Deputy Hale offered a nod that held no mockery. The line in the ledger had done its work. She was no longer just the girl everyone whispered about. She was Naya Cole, and the town was learning to accept it. Life at the cabin had a rhythm now. Naya rose early to scatter feed for the chickens before Nathan came back from a barn. She kept the porch swept and the table neat. sewed fresh patches into his work shirts, and learned how to make the coffee just strong enough that he would drink it without complaint. Nathan repaired the corral gate, built a new rack for firewood, and even fashioned a rail along the porch so her bad leg had something to hold when the yard turned muddy. One morning, she set the stew pot on the stove while he came in from the yard. He watched her move around the room. The way she kept her balance without thinking, the way the calico dress sat right on her shoulders now. She turned and caught him looking. "What?" she asked softly. "Nothing," he said, setting his hat on the peg. "Just looks like you belong here." A small smile touched her face. "I do." He crossed the room then, closed the space between them, and kissed her. Not quick like before, but slow, certain. She leaned into him, her hands resting at his chest, and for a long moment the room was silent except for the sound of the stew simmering on the stove. The following Sunday, they rode to town not for supplies, but to stand together at the small stretch of land by the church where Nathan's wife and boy lay buried. Naya stood beside him while he cleared the weeds from the markers. When he was done, he stayed still, hat in hand. "They were good people," he said quietly. Naya reached for his hand, hesitated, then took it. "I stay here," she said. "With you." He looked at her for a long moment, then squeezed her hand once and nodded. "Then we'll keep it together." By the end of the season, the cabin no longer felt like just a place to sleep. It felt like a home. The mules stood fat in the pen, the chickens were laying regular, and the porch steps stayed solid underfoot. At night, when Nathan hung his hat on the peg, Naya's shawl hung next to it, her crutch leaning close by though she needed it less inside. That evening, after the day's work was done, she stirred the stew while he set the table. The light from the stove warmed the room, glinting off the brass ring on her finger. Nathan sat down, looked across at her, and felt something in him ease that had been tight for years. They ate in companionable silence, then cleaned up together, the clink of tin plates and the sound of water in the basin filling the cabin. When everything was put away, Nathan banked the fire and turned down the lamp. Naya stood near the table, looking at him with dark, steady eyes. "Good night, husband," she said, the word still new on her tongue but sure. He smiled faintly, crossed the room, and kissed her once more before she lay down near the stove. When the lamp finally went out, there were no questions left. Not from the town, not from either of them. She had a name, a home, and a man who had chosen her, and he had found a reason to come back to the cabin every night. Outside, the summer wind moved through the cottonwoods, steady and calm, as if the land itself approved of what had been built there.